Well, this shift in U.S. security policy towards the Western Hemisphere could have global implications, especially for European defense and the war in Ukraine. Almost 4 years into Russia's full-scale invasion, the U.S. president is pushing for a peace deal. Ukraine and its European allies say that any ceasefire agreement needs to include robust security guarantees for Ukraine. Otherwise, they fear Russia could launch a new attack. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has been meeting with key European allies and top U.S. envoys in Paris today. But Trump's actions in Venezuela have raised questions about whether the U.S. could soon completely turn its attention away from Ukraine and European security. All right, joining me now from Washington, D.C. is Kurt Volker. He's a former U.S. ambassador to NATO. He was the U.S. Special Representative to Ukraine during the first Trump administration. Mr. Volker, it's good to see you again. Good to have you back on the program. A Macron advisor described today's talks as the culmination of efforts to prevent the United States from abandoning Ukraine. Is that the correct assessment?
I wouldn't quite phrase it that way, but I understand why the French advisor might. I see this more as a way of consolidating European efforts to provide more leadership in providing security for Ukraine. I don't think that President Trump is going to walk away from Ukraine. He's made this a very high priority since the first day of his administration, urging all sides to make peace. I don't agree with everything he's done and the way he's gone about it, but this is clearly very important to President Trump. One of the things that he has done is tried to get Europe to shoulder more of the burden in handling European security matters. Look, for instance, at the Hague summit of NATO, where he urged European countries to spend 5% of GDP on defense, or getting European nations to buy American weapons to provide them to Ukraine rather than it being provided by U.S. taxpayers. So he's been urging Europe to step up and do more. And I think this Coalition of the Willing summit is demonstrating how Europe is doing exactly that.
We know that President Trump wanted Ukraine, and I'm quoting here, done by Thanksgiving. How badly does that timeline clash with what European leaders are trying to achieve, which is long-term deterrent rather than a quick deal?
Yeah, well, he's been saying all along he wants a quick deal. He wants to get this done. He was going to do this in 1 day. He was going to do it in 100 days. He was going to do it by the 4th of July. Yeah. He had a 2-week deadline. He had another 2-week deadline. The reality is this war continues because Vladimir Putin wants it to. Vladimir Putin wants to take over Ukraine, and so far nothing has convinced him that he will never succeed, so he keeps trying. Now, that being said, we can stop Putin. We can convince him that it is not worth the effort. It's going to take more things like this, more military capacity put on the table, a demonstration he will never win militarily. It's also going to take more financial pressure, drying up the oil and gas revenue that the Kremlin still gets, including from Europe, to pay for this war effort. So there's a lot more we can do to accelerate Putin needing a ceasefire that we can do to shorten that timeline. But it is right now still a very long timeline because Putin believes he can still prevail.
I want to come back to Vladimir Putin in just a moment, but I want to ask you about what we've seen in the past few days. President Trump obviously sees the intervention in Venezuela and the detention of Nicolas Maduro as a complete success. How do you see that affecting his attitude towards Ukraine?
Well, it's interesting, and he's even said a couple of things since then. One of them, he made a rather derisive comment about Putin, saying that he had lied to him about Ukrainian drones striking his house. He also was very critical of the Russian military and made a contrast of the American military going in 3 hours and accomplishing their objective, while Russia has been attacking Ukraine for 4 years and everybody just dies, whereas no one on the U.S. side was killed in this operation in Venezuela. Now, the danger signal in all of this is Trump's assertion of a sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere, saying this is ours to deal with, irrespective of anyone else's interests. And here, Putin will likely make a similar claim about Ukraine, that is Russia's sphere of interest. I hope that the United States and European allies firmly reject such an assertion by Putin. It is clearly a part of Europe. It is an independent sovereign state and not something just to be divvied up.
You know, you talk about spheres of influence. That brings us to a quote from about 6 years ago. The former Trump advisor on Russia, Fiona Hill, she testified to Congress in 2019 that Russia informally offered to end its support for Venezuela in exchange for U.S. acquiescence on Ukraine. Were you aware of this, Mr. Volker? And is that what we're seeing play out right now?
Right. Well, yes, I was aware of that at the time. And of course, the Trump administration at that time was very much against that. It's a different administration now. But at the time, we were very much against that. And no, I don't think it's what we're seeing play out now, because you're seeing the U.S. assert its own sphere of influence, irrespective of Russia supporting Maduro, of trying to get one of their shadow fleet vessels out of there, having military advisors there, having Cuban military advisors there, having condemned this invasion, the seizure of the Venezuelan president. And President Trump has ignored all of those Russian complaints and comments. So rather than being a deal, this is Trump acting very much unilaterally.
Well, I know that you have said that Vladimir Putin has not given in on anything when it comes to Ukraine ever since the beginning of the war. But he really wouldn't have an incentive to give in on anything if he expects this to be his reality, Venezuela for the U.S. and Ukraine for Russia. How do you see that?
Well, he will certainly assert that. Remember, he didn't invade Ukraine because of U.S. policy or European policy. He invaded Ukraine on his own reasons. He wanted to take it over, to eliminate Ukraine as a national identity, to eliminate Ukraine as a sovereign and independent state. He did all that for his own reasons. Now, he will try to assemble arguments to make those actions look justified, but that doesn't mean those arguments are relevant at all. He's doing this because that is his overall desire. And I don't think President Trump's action in Venezuela will change Putin's calculus in any way. He'll just use it now as one further excuse.
Does Venezuela reinforce President Trump's belief that foreign policy problems can be solved quickly? I mean, and does it make him less patient with Ukraine's slower and riskier negotiations?
Well, it's yet to be seen, because what we've seen so far with Venezuela is a couple of days that seems to have been successful. A very clean snatch and grab operation to get Maduro and bring him to a court in the U.S., and the vice president of Venezuela stepping in to maintain continuity of government there. But we haven't seen how this plays out over a few months. Does she comply fully with U.S. wishes? Does the regime regroup and push back? Do they have an internal strife that becomes more and more unstable, perhaps even bloody, that the U.S. is responsible for? We just haven't seen how this is going to play out yet. As for Ukraine, the president has been very clear. He thinks that Russia's operation from the beginning was a disaster. They should have, as the Biden administration said, and Trump later said, they should have taken Kyiv in a couple of days, but they were incompetent. They were not able to do that. They were pushed back. And now, for 4 years, they've been unable to mount a successful military operation, which shows really the weakness of Russia's position. And by contrast, the relative strength and effectiveness of the U.S. military.
Let me ask you, before we run out of time, has Ukraine crossed the point where it is no longer President Trump's top foreign policy deal perspective? And if so, what does that mean for Ukraine's security after a ceasefire?
Well, I don't think President Trump limits himself to just one priority or one deal. He keeps talking about all 9 wars that he's seeking to end, giving himself credit for 8 1/4 so far. I think that Venezuela is now an immediate priority because he has to make sure it doesn't go badly. But in terms of Ukraine, this is the real prize that he wants. He wants to succeed in bringing peace to Ukraine and to get the credit for that. Similar to the way he feels he brought peace to Gaza and ended that war, or that he ended the war between India and Pakistan.
Mr. Volker, unfortunately, we're out of time, but we appreciate your time and your insights tonight. Great discussion. Thank you.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Right, well, Eric Ciaramella is a senior fellow for Russia and Eurasia at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and joins us from Washington, D.C. Welcome to DW News. Eric, let me start with a rather, I suppose, simple question. We hear some people saying that the meeting in Paris today was a breakthrough. Would you agree?
Well, I think it's too soon to say whether it's a breakthrough. It's potentially a significant set of actions that European leaders have committed to. But if you read the fine print, you realize that it's still conditioned on a number of things that seem quite distant prospects. The first is a ceasefire that Russia would agree to. And I see no evidence that Vladimir Putin is in any mood to agree to a ceasefire, let alone one that would involve a significant European troop presence on Ukrainian soil or significant European support for Ukraine. And the second part that I still find unrealistic is this expectation of a firm U.S. security guarantee that Donald Trump would supposedly give to European forces or to Ukraine. And I think Trump's record on Ukraine and Russia so far shows that he's not really willing to do anything significant to pressure Russia. And so I would find any of those commitments to be rather shallow and hollow. That is, unless somehow it goes through a procedure of broader political buy-in in the United States, including going through Congress, which some have alluded to.
Right.
But
let me jump in there quickly, Eric. I just want to, because I want to sort of look at the United States' role there. What role do you think then the Trump administration is looking to play in a post-war Ukraine?
I think so far Trump has telegraphed that he wants to play the least active role possible, and that he may be open to some sort of passive support in the form of intelligence sharing, early warning, so on and so forth, maybe some mechanism of ceasefire monitoring that would be based on U.S. technical means. But I don't see him willing to make good on any sort of robust commitment, for example, to come to the aid of Ukraine if it were attacked, or European troops if they were attacked inside Ukraine.
Now, the UK and France say they would send troops to Ukraine if a ceasefire is reached with Russia. How big of a deterrent do you think Western troops on the ground in Ukraine would be for Moscow?
Again, I think it depends on the details. And I think in the current construct of the policy conversation on security guarantees, everything is conditioned on Russia agreeing to a ceasefire. So when you have Russia as the ultimate arbiter of whether or not the troops are deployed, it becomes very difficult to see how Britain and France ever would deploy said troops, because it's almost impossible to envision Russia agreeing to that. That said, if they did deploy troops, regardless of what Russia said, it could be somewhat of a factor that enters into Russian calculus, where the Russians would have to be a little bit more worried about escalation of risks vis-a-vis NATO. But still, I think that the kind of level of forces that we're talking about and the kinds of missions, it wouldn't be primarily to deter. That mission set would be undertaken by the Ukrainian armed forces, trained and equipped, of course, in large part by Western partners, but rather to enable the Ukrainian forces to carry out that deterrence mission. There's been talk of helping the Ukrainians regenerate their forces. I think that's a much more realistic mission than deterrence, especially when we're only talking about a few thousand troops on the ground.
Great to get your analysis there, Eric. Eric Ciaramella, Senior Fellow for Russia and Eurasia at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Thanks for joining us tonight on DW News.
Thanks for having me.
All right, let's go now to our correspondent, Rosie Birchard. She is in Paris following these talks for us. Rosie, there was a lot of talk about significant steps or even breakthroughs. What are they?
Well, it's the most concrete commitment we've seen yet, a step toward potential European boots on the ground in Ukraine sometime down the line when a ceasefire is agreed. And definitely Ukraine's President Zelenskyy said he felt this was historic, something that could certainly not have been agreed a year ago. I was in the room and the mood among these leaders certainly was buoyant. They talked about paving the way for a legal framework in future to support Ukraine through land, sea and air action. But make no mistake, there are a lot of caveats here. Firstly, that we don't really have any details as of yet in terms of troop numbers. Where would they be? On what terms? What would happen in the event of a further Russian aggression? Those details, we are told, will be worked out in future documents, but they will also be subject to approval from all sorts of different European parliaments if countries do want to contribute. Germany, for its part, Friedrich Merz, the Chancellor, said he would not rule anything out in terms of Germany's contribution, but stressed that that would be subject to confirmation from the German government and German lawmakers.
And of course, all of this is for the time after a peace deal has been reached. So are we any closer to a peace deal this evening or just a ceasefire agreement?
I talked about a lot of caveats. Of course, the biggest caveat is that there is no ceasefire. We're talking right now still about hypotheticals. Even though we've never seen these proposed security guarantees spelled out so clearly, they remain just words on paper for now, because they would only kick in if a ceasefire were to be agreed. And the fact is that there's a lot of skepticism here as to whether Russia has actually got any real interest in peace at the moment. So I think while they are framing it as a step forward, insofar as you couldn't have a ceasefire, they say, without having these credible security guarantees spelled out in terms of what they would look like, the ceasefire itself still remains out of reach. There are talks ongoing in terms of future peace talks for Ukraine. We know they will continue here in Paris with the American representatives and the Ukrainian delegation. But peace, especially if you're living on Ukraine, continue to be under Russian bombardment, still for now, it has to be said, feels quite far off.
Yeah, and speaking of the American representatives, let's talk about the ones who were in the room there where you are. I'm talking about Witkoff and Jared Kushner. They are the people who actually talked to Moscow. How important was it that they were present when these deals or these agreements were reached?
It was absolutely crucial, because what the Europeans were looking for was a clear commitment from the US to step in and back European troops up if they came into danger during their eventual peacekeeping efforts somewhere down the line. And the French president certainly seemed to be sure that that is something they had got from the Americans in terms of a clear commitment. And in fact, when the American side was asked, Steve Witkoff seemed quite positive about that as well. He said President Trump is clear on his commitments. That being said, in the actual document that came out, it was very interesting to see that every mention of US support was caveated with the word proposed, and some of this may have to go through lawmakers' approval in the United States as well. Certainly the Europeans saying they've got what they were asking for in terms of support from the US, and there was even an idea of a US-led ceasefire monitoring mission, so the US taking a lead there. That's something that the French will be congratulating themselves on diplomatically, and it's something that has been welcomed by the Ukrainian president as well.
Still lots of I's to dot and T's to cross, though, with this agreement. DW's Rosie Birchard with the latest in Paris tonight. Rosie, thank you.